I still remember the heat that day, thick, heavy, almost suffocating. The scent of gasoline clung to the air as I stepped out of the convenience store, a steaming cup of black coffee in my hand. I glanced toward the pump where our old minivan had been parked just moments earlier. It was gone. At first, I thought maybe they'd moved it to another side of the station. Maybe my dad needed more space to maneuver, or my mom had gone to check the air pump. But then, I saw it, the taillights of our van disappearing onto the highway, fading fast into the distance like a bad dream slipping out of reach. My phone buzzed in my pocket. One new message from Mom. Let's see how long it takes him to get home. That was it. No joke, no explanation. Just a cruel little emoji to seal the punchline of their twisted lesson. I called her immediately, straight to voicemail. I tried Dad, same result. I stood there, sweat trickling down my neck, the coffee burning in my hand, my heart pounding in disbelief. I was 17. And I'd just been left behind by my own parents, like trash someone forgot to take home. I didn't know it then, but that moment, right there on the pavement of a roadside gas station, would change the entire trajectory of my life. That was the last time I ever saw them, until they showed up at my office, begging. If this story hit home, drop a 1 in the comments. Let me know, would you have stayed quiet like me, or exploded right there in the cafe? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this channel with someone who needs to hear this. Thank you for watching. Growing up in a small town on the outskirts of Amarillo, Texas, life was quiet, routine, predictable, the kind of place where everyone knew your name, and privacy was a luxury. I was just another teenager trying to find my footing, not rebellious, not reckless, just different. I liked books more than sports, solitude more than noise, and fixing things more than making small talk. My name is Ethan Miller, and by 17, I'd already learned how to keep my head down and stay out of trouble, mostly because trouble at home came in a very different form than most people imagined. My parents, Ron and Patricia Miller, weren't monsters, not in the obvious way. They didn't scream or throw punches, didn't get drunk or disappear for days. No, they prided themselves on being what they called disciplinarians, champions of old-school parenting, believers in what my dad liked to call tough love. What that really meant was using humiliation and emotional control as some twisted form of character building. Forget to mow the lawn? You were up at 4:30 the next morning doing it in your pajamas. Missed a chore? You were grounded, not just from TV or your phone, but from dinner, too. There was the time I came home with a B- on a chemistry quiz, and they locked me out of the house for the night. I ended up sleeping in the garage on a pile of rags next to the lawnmower. When I broke a window trying to get inside, they made me pay for it using my own savings from a part-time job. They called it building responsibility. I called it cruelty with a polite face. My sister Emily, on the other hand, was the golden child. 2 years younger than me, she walked through life with a halo she never asked for, but one our parents gladly placed on her head. It wasn't her fault, really. She was kind, warm, and talented in all the right ways. Straight A's, choir solos, cheer team captain. Mom and Dad praised her like she was a prize-winning show pony. Every report card was celebrated, every small achievement treated like a breakthrough. When she forgot her chores, it was she's just tired. When I forgot mine, it was a lecture about failure and laziness. I could fix a leaking sink without being asked, and they'd barely look up. Emily could burn a batch of cookies, and they'd call it adorable. Over time, I stopped trying to win their approval. I started fading into the background of my own family. And maybe that's why they thought it was okay to leave me behind that day, because somewhere along the way, they stopped seeing me as a son and started seeing me as a project that didn't turn out right. It all happened so fast that at first, my brain couldn't register it as real. I stood there in front of the gas station, sun beating down on the asphalt, clutching a cup of coffee that was already starting to go cold in my hand. The air smelled like motor oil and fried chicken from the deli counter inside. My eyes scanned the lot again, hoping, praying, that maybe I'd somehow missed the car, that maybe they'd pulled around back or gone to a different pump. But no. The highway in front of me was empty now, the only trace of them a faint cloud of dust and the echo of a joke that didn't feel like one. I checked my phone again, hoping there was some explanation waiting, something that would make this make sense. Just that one text, sitting there like a slap to the face. Let's see how long it takes him to get home. Smiling face with smiling eyes. I kept calling. Straight to voicemail. Again and again, until the battery warning started blinking at the top of the screen. That's when I knew. This wasn't a joke. This was intentional. They really left me. Like luggage forgotten at a bus terminal. Like I didn't matter enough to take with them. Something cracked open inside me in that moment. I felt it, like a cord snapping, a weight lifting and crashing down all at once. All the years of trying, of waiting for them to notice me, to appreciate me, to love me the way they loved her, it all unraveled in a matter of minutes. It wasn't just the betrayal that gutted me. It was the clarity. The ugly, brutal truth I'd been too hopeful to admit until that moment. They didn't care. Maybe they never did. I wasn't their son, I was their lesson. A living, breathing punishment they could mold and mock until I either broke or became what they wanted. But I wasn't going to break. Not for them. Not anymore. I looked down at the coffee in my hand, the steam barely rising now, and realized I didn't want to go home. Not just because I didn't know how, I didn't want to. That place wasn't home. It never had been. I went back inside the gas station and walked up to the tired-looking cashier, a man with sun-leathered skin and a name tag that read Kenny. I asked where the nearest bus station was. He pointed down the road, said it was about 2 miles. I nodded, thanked him, then hesitated. Mind if I use your phone? He slid it across the counter without a word. I dialed the one number I hadn't called in years, my mom's sister, Aunt Marie. They hadn't spoken to her in almost a decade, claimed she was a bad influence, too soft, too permissive. But I remembered her differently. I remembered warmth. I remembered her slipping me candy when no one was looking and hugging me like she meant it. When she picked up on the second ring and heard my voice, her tone changed instantly. Ethan? Honey, what's wrong? I told her everything. I tried not to cry, but my voice cracked halfway through. Her answer was immediate, tell me where you are. I'm getting you out of there. Within an hour, she had a local cab company pick me up and had already booked me a bus ticket to Denver. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't hesitate. She just did what no one else had ever done for me, she showed up. Denver felt like a different world entirely. The air was cooler, the streets wider, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't walking on eggshells. Aunt Marie's house sat on a quiet street lined with tall trees and weathered porches, the kind of neighborhood where people waved at you just because. She didn't smother me with questions when I arrived. She didn't push or prod. Instead, she made me a hot meal, showed me to a spare bedroom, and told me I could stay as long as I needed. There was something healing in that quiet acceptance, in the way she didn't try to fix me, just made space for me to breathe. Some nights I'd find her sitting on the back porch, humming softly with a glass of tea in her hand, and I'd just sit beside her without speaking. I didn't know it then, but that calm was planting something in me, something I didn't realize I'd been missing, peace. Over the next few months, I started to piece myself together. I enrolled in a GED program at the local community center, and for the first time, learning didn't feel like punishment. I worked mornings at a nearby auto shop, cleaning bays and running errands, then spent evenings studying or helping Marie fix things around the house. The work was honest, and the progress was slow, but it felt like mine. When I passed my exams, she took me out for dinner at a diner down the street and told me she'd never been prouder. Later, I signed up for a trade certification in electrical work, then carpentry, then structural design. I found I had a knack for it, not just the physical labor, but the planning, the vision. I liked building things that lasted. Within a couple of years, I was working full-time in residential construction, then managing small projects, then leading teams. Each step forward was a quiet rebellion against the boy they'd tried to break. It wasn't until my third year living with Aunt Marie that the past came knocking in a way I didn't expect. We were sitting in the kitchen one evening, sharing a pot of coffee, when she hesitated mid-sentence and looked down at her hands. There was something different in her voice when she finally spoke. "I never told you what your parents said the night before they left you," she said, eyes clouded with something between guilt and anger. I looked at her, unsure what she meant. "They were at a barbecue," she continued, "a family gathering. I wasn't invited, of course, but your cousin Tim was there. He told me later that your dad was bragging, laughing, about how he and Patricia were going to teach you a real-world lesson on their way home." I felt my stomach twist as she went on. "He said, let's see how long it takes the boy to figure it out. Maybe a little abandonment will build some backbone." People thought he was joking. But then the next day, you called me. My heart sank. I had always suspected cruelty, but hearing that it was planned, premeditated, discussed like some twisted prank over barbecue ribs and cheap beer, it did something to me I couldn't fully describe. The abandonment hadn't been a moment of thoughtless anger, it had been a performance. A power play. And I'd been nothing more than a prop in their little show. That knowledge didn't break me. It sharpened me. It turned every step I'd taken since that day into a quiet, righteous defiance. By the time I turned 37, I had built a life that was steady, quiet, and fully mine. I ran a successful construction company based out of Fort Collins, Colorado, with a dozen full-time employees and a client list that stretched across the state. I had a home with a wraparound porch and a dog that followed me everywhere like a shadow. I had a wife who saw me, not the version of me shaped by scars and silence, but the man I had grown into. And I had 2 kids who never had to wonder if they were loved. I didn't carry my past like a wound anymore, it was just a story I rarely told. A chapter that had ended a long time ago. Or so I thought. The first call came on a Thursday afternoon, during a team meeting. Unknown number, straight to voicemail. Then another. And another. By the time I stepped out of the conference room, I had 17 missed calls and 4 voicemails, 3 of them from numbers I didn't recognize and 1 from my sister Emily. Her voice cracked through the speaker like it was trying to push through 2 decades of silence. "Ethan, please call me. It's about Mom and Dad. They found you." I stood there staring at my phone, a strange numbness spreading through my chest. I hadn't spoken to Emily since I left. She was just 15 back then, too young to fully understand what happened, too close to our parents to pull away. I'd always assumed she believed their version of the story, or worse, didn't care enough to ask for mine. Later that evening, after the kids were in bed and my wife had fallen asleep on the couch, I listened to the rest of the messages. Some were pleading. Some angry. One sounded like my mother crying. Another was my father's voice, rough and bitter. "We made one mistake and you disappeared like a coward. You think you're better than us now? With your fancy life and your big company? We made you. You owe us." The rage I thought I had buried flickered again, but not because of his words. It was the sheer audacity that after 20 years of silence, they still saw themselves as victims in their own story. I opened the old box I kept in my office closet, the one I hadn't touched in years. Inside, among faded documents and photos, was a cheap flip phone I'd kept purely out of habit. I powered it on and scrolled through the saved audio files. And there it was, the one I had almost forgotten about. The recording from that day, the day at the gas station, captured in grainy sound and static-laced laughter. My father's voice, smug and unmistakable, "Let's see how long it takes him to get home." Then my mother's giggle, "Do you think he'll cry?" That recording had haunted me once. Now, it felt like a weapon sharpened by time. Because while they had spent 2 decades rewriting the past, I still had the truth, and this time, I wasn't going to keep it quiet. They came to my office on a Monday morning, uninvited and unannounced. I saw them through the glass wall before the receptionist even buzzed me, my father in his old brown suit that never quite fit, my mother clinging to a crumpled tissue, tears already smeared across her makeup. They looked smaller than I remembered, older, more fragile, but that didn't move me. It only reminded me of how easily they used appearances to bend people to their will. When I stepped into the hallway, my mother rushed forward with a choked sob, arms outstretched. "My baby boy," she cried, her voice trembling like she thought it would soften me. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. "Let's keep this professional," I said coldly, motioning toward the meeting room. My father's expression darkened immediately. "Is that how you greet your parents after all these years?" he barked. "After everything we've done for you?" I didn't answer. I just held the door open and let them walk in first. They took their seats like actors settling into a well-rehearsed scene. My mother dabbed her eyes, trembling with theatrical sadness, while my father launched into his sermon about family, forgiveness, and duty. "We raised you. We taught you everything you know. This success of yours, you wouldn't have it without us." I sat quietly, watching them spin the narrative like they always had. When they finally reached the point, when my mother whispered about the mortgage and the foreclosure notice, when my father finally choked out the number they needed, I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands. "Funny you brought up the house," I said, keeping my tone level. "You should have checked the county records before you came here." They blinked in confusion. I opened the folder on the table and slid the papers across. "I bought the debt. Your mortgage was auctioned off last month. My company now owns the property." My father's face drained of color. My mother stared at the documents, lips moving silently as she read. "You can't, you wouldn't," she stammered. "I did," I said. "And you have 30 days to vacate." The silence that followed was deafening. My father stood, knocking over his chair. "You arrogant little bastard," he growled. "You'd really throw your own family onto the street?" I stood too, meeting his glare without flinching. "You threw me away a long time ago," I said quietly. "This is just overdue payback." My mother burst into another fit of tears, calling me cruel, heartless, unforgiving. I let her cry. I didn't owe her comfort. I owed her nothing at all. But I wasn't finished. I reached into the same folder and pulled out another document, a set of development plans stamped and approved. "You should also know that we're not keeping the house," I said. "We're demolishing it." My father's mouth opened, but no words came. "The land will be used to build a community center. A shelter. For teenagers who've been abused, abandoned, neglected. The kind of kids who end up at bus stations with no one to call." My mother shook her head in disbelief. "You're joking. That's our home." I nodded slowly. "No. That was never a home. It was a prison you decorated with smiles and excuses." I slid the last page across the table, the one that bore the name in bold lettering, the Marie Haven Youth Center. My mother's jaw quivered when she saw it. "Marie? That woman? She turned you against us." I felt a flicker of satisfaction watching their faces twist. "She saved me," I said. "She gave me the love and safety you never could. This center, this place, it will carry her name, not yours. Her legacy will stand where your cruelty once lived." My father lunged, knocking the documents off the table, but security was already at the door. I didn't stop them as they escorted my parents out. I just watched through the glass, calm and silent, as they were removed from my life for the last time. Emily showed up later that evening, storming into my office like a thundercloud. Her face was flushed, her voice tight with emotion, and I could tell from the moment she opened her mouth that she'd come to defend them. "I can't believe you did that," she snapped, arms crossed like she was bracing for impact. "They're our parents, Ethan. You didn't have to humiliate them like that. Throwing them out? Destroying their house? That's not justice, it's revenge." I didn't respond right away. I just watched her pace across the room, a storm of frustration and misplaced guilt. She wasn't angry because I was wrong, she was angry because she'd spent years believing in a lie, and now it was unraveling in front of her. "They're old, they're scared, and yes, they made mistakes," she continued, her voice shaking, "but you've turned into someone cold. This isn't you. I walked over to my desk drawer and pulled out a folder I'd been keeping for years, unopened, untouched, until now. I handed it to her without a word. She hesitated, then slowly opened it. Inside were printouts of texts, copies of birthday cards with backhanded messages, a flash drive with voicemails, and a transcript of that gas station recording. For a while, she didn't say anything. She just flipped through the pages, her fingers trembling as the truth seeped into her. Her face paled as she read the message my mother sent that day, the emoji-smothered cruelty spelled out in black and white. Then she played the audio, Dad's laughter, Mom's voice mocking me, and the tears finally started. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I never knew it was this bad." I nodded slowly. "You were a kid, Emily. You believed what they told you. That I ran away. That I cut them off without reason. But they didn't tell you what really happened, because if they had, they knew you'd never look at them the same again." She wiped her face, still holding the papers like they weighed 100 pounds. "I'm sorry," she said, voice breaking. "I thought you were punishing them out of spite. I didn't realize you were protecting yourself." I almost left it there, but something in me needed her to see it all, the final, undeniable piece of proof. I reached into the folder and pulled out one last document, an envelope yellowed with age but still sealed, addressed in my father's handwriting. I opened it and laid the contents on the table. It was a notarized letter from their lawyer dated just 1 week after the gas station incident. It declared me emotionally unstable, ungrateful, and no longer part of the Miller family, and stated their intent to remove me from any will, trust, or financial obligation. They hadn't just left me behind that day, they'd erased me. "They disinherited me before they even knew where I went," I said quietly. "I wasn't a son to them. I was a mistake they thought they could erase." Emily looked down at the letter, her shoulders sinking under the weight of it all. She didn't argue again. She just sat there in silence, holding the truth in her hands for the very first time. The morning of the demolition was crisp and cloudless, the kind of day that almost felt too perfect for what was about to happen. I stood across the street, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, watching as the bulldozers rolled into position in front of the house I used to live in, the house where love was conditional, silence was survival, and everything about me was never quite enough. The windows were already stripped bare, the porch rails removed, and the front door hung crooked on its hinges like it was giving up before the first swing of the wrecking ball. My parents weren't there. They'd left days earlier, too proud to witness their own downfall, too bitter to face what their actions had cost them. I didn't need them there. Their absence said more than their presence ever could. As the first blow cracked through the roof, I felt something uncoil inside me, something deep, something old. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even revenge in the way people think of it. It was release. It was closure. I thought about the boy I'd been, standing in front of a gas station with a coffee and a phone full of voicemails that never came. I thought about the nights I'd stayed awake wondering if I was the broken one, if I'd imagined it all, if I'd deserved it. And now, here I was, not just surviving, but building something better out of the rubble they left behind. The pain didn't disappear, but it didn't define me anymore. I'd taken what they used to try and destroy me and turned it into the very thing that set me free. When the last wall fell, I turned to the crew and gave them the signal. A few minutes later, the new sign went up, bold and bright on freshly poured concrete. The letters were clean and clear: Marie Haven, shelter for youth. A place for kids who had no safe place to land, no one to call, no Aunt Marie waiting with open arms. A place where they'd be seen. Where they'd matter. Where they'd heal. I sipped my coffee again, the bitter warmth grounding me, and smiled, not for what I'd torn down, but for what I'd finally begun. If someone hurts you beyond repair, abandons you, breaks you, leaves scars you carry for years, do you still owe them forgiveness just because they share your blood? Is the title of family enough to excuse cruelty, manipulation, or betrayal? Or do you owe yourself something more sacred, peace? Too often, we're taught that forgiveness is a moral obligation, especially when it comes to parents or siblings. But what if the path to healing doesn't lie in letting them back in, but in letting yourself move forward without them? What if real strength isn't in mending broken bonds, but in learning how to live free from them? So ask yourself, who are you protecting by forgiving people who never once protected you? And at what cost? Because the truth is, blood might make you related, but healing is what makes you whole. You don't owe loyalty to people who only offered you pain. You don't have to keep opening doors just because someone shares your last name. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. Some scars aren't meant to fade, they're meant to remind you of how far you've come, of everything you've survived. Your story doesn't have to end in bitterness, but it also doesn't have to end in reunion. It can end in freedom. In boundaries. In choosing the life they never gave you. You are not the broken version of yourself they tried to leave behind. You are not what they did to you, you are what you rose above. And sometimes, the most powerful form of healing is walking away without ever looking back.